Micah was resting in bed, wrapped up in so many bandages he was starting to resemble a mummy. He couldn't help but smile softly as Mrs. Tully clucked around him like a mother hen and occasionally shook her head. He also wasn't complaining about the amount of painkiller she'd stuck in his arm. He could see himself in the dresser mirror across the room and started to cock an eyebrow, but decided against it when it instantly hurt. They'd already assured him Anthony was dead, but he couldn't help wishing the alpha werewolf was still alive, so he could torture the bastard the same way he'd been tortured. The story they'd told him had sounded like a quick death. He wouldn't have made it quick. I think you shifters are going to end up being the death of me, Mrs. Tully exclaimed softly. The shifters, both jaguars and cougars, held a soft spot in her heart. She'd delivered every single one of them and had been very close to their mother. Just look at the shape you got yourself into. Micah pointed at the ceiling, feeling dizzy when the ceiling fan kept going round and round. It wasn't my fault that I got kidnapped and tortured. Mrs. Tully softly tapped him on the forehead with the tips of her fingers. I beg to differ, young Skywalker. If the stories I heard were true, you stood up to that horrid werewolf, and that's what got you kidnapped. So you're saying I brought it on myself? Don't interrupt your elders. Mrs. Tully came back with a stern look. I wasn't finished. As I was saying, you stood up to that mongrel dog, and I have to say, it was something long overdue. Micah looked pointedly over at Quinn with an "I told you so" smirk. He wasn't ready to forgive his brother. He'd warned Quinn about Anthony and had been told to stand down. He hoped Big Brother was happy because now he couldn't stand up. Stop that! Mrs. Tully growled and slapped him on the top of his head. The action made his lingering headache start to thump, and he squeezed his eyes shut. Hey, I'm hurt here, Micah complained. You'll make it worse if you keep up this sibling rivalry, Mrs. Tully retorted, and gave the same warning look to Quinn. I need to call my granddaughter and let her know where I am. The poor dear will be worried if I'm not home to answer the phone. Mrs. Tully didn't wait for anyone to show her where the phone was. This wasn't the first time she'd been to the Wilder residence. She missed a step when she noticed Michael sitting quietly in a chair in the shadowed corner of the room. It wasn't like the charming vampire to be so dark and brooding. When the door closed behind her, all eyes turned back to Micah. It's good to see you finally back home where you belong, Stephen said with a soft smile, trying to hide the fact that he was worried. Even though Micah was home, something was telling Stephen he wasn't out of danger. Micah was pale, and his eyes were a bit too shiny for Stephen's liking. Micah returned the smile, but was starting to get drowsy. It's just good to be out of that hellhole. You were very reckless this time, Quinn stated from his position near the window, and crossed his arms over his chest. You could have died down in that basement if we hadn't seen that message you sent to Alicia. Micah looked around the room for his little sister and frowned. Speaking of Alicia, where is she? I thought for sure she'd be here. She's staying over at a friend's house until this all blows over, Kat answered. She glanced at Quinn, wondering how long he was going to wait until he called their sister and told her to come home. Why didn't she come back with us from Anthony's? Micah asked. I thought for sure she'd... Again, he glanced toward Quinn, putting the blame for Alicia's absence on him simply because he wanted to. Nick shook his head, but was inwardly cringing. He tried not to look at Michael, knowing the vampire had erased everyone's memory except for his and Micah's. Dude, you must have had one too many hits to the head. Alicia wasn't at Anthony's. But she was there, Micah insisted. I saw her with my own eyes. He glared at Nick, but the man just shrugged and shook his head. He looked from one face to the next and realized that none of them would confirm Alicia being at the mansion. He remembered her being in the basement, holding his hand. She was crying, and it would eat at him until he saw her again and made sure she was all right. He didn't know which had hurt worse, seeing her cry or being almost killed. He glanced around one more time, making note of the fact that the man who had been with Alicia was also missing from the crowd. Huffing, he pressed back against the pillows and silently planned to find out which friend Alicia was staying with. He'd hunt her down and demand the truth from her. You must have been hallucinating, Jewel said softly. Micah looked over at the pretty blonde and frowned. Who are you? This is Jewel Scott Wilder, Stephen said, and wrapped his good arm around her shoulders. Mrs. Tully had already taken care of his own bullet wounds and had his other arm in a sling for now. She's my mate. Anthony's Jewel Scott? Now Micah was even more confused. Only within Anthony's demented mind, Stephen responded, but couldn't stop himself from pulling Jewel a little tighter against him. Micah blinked and looked over at Quinn to ask confirmation, when he saw Cat was snuggled up against his older brother. With a sigh, he wondered how high a dose of drugs Mrs. Tully had actually given him, because either he was losing his mind or everyone else was losing theirs. He glanced up at the only other person in the room he knew that had any common sense, Warren. Did I pull a Rip Van Winkle or something? I mean, when I left, Stephen was single and Quinn had about as much romantic inclination as Dean. Warren smiled. Quite a bit has happened since you've been gone. Okay, my phone call is made, Mrs. Tully announced as she walked back in. She actually hadn't called her granddaughter. She'd only said that to give them a moment alone with Micah before running them off. Now, everyone out, and allow this little kitten to get some sleep. Micah growled at the older woman. I am not a kitten. Dear, my youngest cat could beat you in a fight with the shape you're in right now, and she's a wimp, runs from her own shadow, Mrs. Tully informed him. While she talked, she took a needle from the odd-looking box she'd brought with her. I'm not sure I need any more drugs. He had a lot of catching up to do. The mere fact that he hadn't seen Alicia yet made him ache worse than the broken bones did. And that's why you're not the doctor. Mrs. Tully was glad he still had that strange sense of humor. Once he started healing, he was going to need it. Micah growled softly when the needle sank into his arm and had to look away. He hated taking orders from anyone, and what he needed to be doing was tracking down his sister. Everyone filed out of the room when she promptly pulled the empty syringe from his arm. Mrs. Tully watched them go, then turned back to Micah, who was already asleep. His family was happy he was home, but the truth was, she was worried for the cougar. His injuries were so severe she was surprised he was still alive. Both of his kneecaps had been shattered by bullets, his ribs broken by being struck continuously over a period of time. It also looked like his back had been flayed by a whip of some kind. He was dehydrated, malnourished, and he had an infection spreading through his bloodstream. She would have given him penicillin had he been human, but sadly, human antibiotics didn't have any effect on the paranormal. Even though were-animals healed very quickly, it didn't mean they couldn't be permanently injured or mortally wounded. She would consider him lucky if he survived the infection. She glanced out of the corner of her eye at Michael, who hadn't left and was sitting very still in his chair. Mrs. Tully decided to leave him alone. She thought a lot of Michael, and if he wanted to stay, then she would not make him leave. He was another that often came to her, but it was mostly to bring her the wounded, never for injury of his own. With a sigh, Mrs. Tully packed away her equipment and stood up. With a slight nod in Michael's direction, she quietly left the room. Michael knew it was time to leave. He'd only been waiting for his anger to fade. Alicia was a handful, but Damon should have never brought her into the middle of a gunfight like that. He could still see the possessive look on Damon's face when he'd wrapped his arms around her, and wondered if history was setting itself up to be repeated. His gaze returned to what was left of Micah, and the image of Alicia crying as she held her brother's hand came back to haunt him. Another image flashed through his mind. The image of Dean grabbing his own hand and laying it on Cain to keep him from dying. Between him and Dean, Cain's injury had healed right in front of them. Michael had never thought about it, but he'd seen sin do things like that in the past. There was one time in particular that stood out in Michael's mind, so long ago that he had all but forgotten it. It was during one of their many traveling excursions, and they'd come across an injured child. He smiled softly in remembrance of Damon and Cain's reactions to the little girl. One of her legs had been broken, and she had several bruises that were in various stages of healing. The child had insisted she'd only fallen, but the guys knew there was nothing in the clearing that could have caused those injuries. When Damon knelt down in front of the little girl and started to compel her to tell the truth, Sin had pushed him away, saying, "You don't do that to an innocent child." They'd offered to help her get back to her house, but instantly smelt the fear that rose within the child. But it wasn't fear of them. It was fear of going home that made the little girl's heart pound. Though the child hadn't said anything, Michael had known that her parents had been the ones responsible for all of her injuries, not just the broken leg. Sin had said nothing to the child about it and dried her tears. Instead, he asked about her siblings, and she replied that she had none. She started talking about her grandmother, who lived in the mountains, and her eyes shone with a grandchild's love. While she spoke, Sin had placed his hand directly over the girl's hurt leg. When she finished her story, not only was her leg healed, but all of her bruises had also vanished. That was when Sin had really shocked Michael. While Cain picked the girl up in his arms and started playing with her, Sin stepped closer to Michael and Damon. Looking at Damon, he said, "You are never to tamper with a child's mind, except for this time. She does not need to remember the beatings, but she does remember the death of her parents." His eyes had grown so cold as he added, "It was by fire." With that, Sin had turned and walked down the path that obviously led to the girl's home. Cain made no secret that he wanted to keep the girl and raise her. He'd always had a soft spot for children. They all had soft spots, but Cain's was really bad. He'd buy a whole toy store for them if the whim struck him. And it had, a few times. However, Sin had insisted on doing the right thing and taken the child to her beloved grandmother. When the sun rose the next morning, word had quickly spread around the village of a home burning to the ground. The remains of a man and woman had been found, but their child, a small girl, was missing. The 4 men had quickly left the village on horseback, heading into what was known as the Swiss Alps. After delivering the girl to her extended family, Sin had given the grandmother a letter and a sack of gold coins as he exchanged a few words with her. The older woman smiled and hugged Sin tightly before taking her granddaughter up in her arms. Though Sin never said anything, they knew that he was the one responsible for the death of the girl's parents. To this day, it made Michael shiver when he thought too long about it. Sin's moral code refused to let any child suffer such misery, and, if he could do anything about it, he would. Sin didn't give a damn who the parent was or what they represented. He believed abusive parents deserved nothing less than what they would eventually do to their children. When Michael asked about Sin's healing ability on the child, Sin had given him a patient smile. The power resides within your immortal soul. Compared to immortality, you are still a child, so most of your power is dormant. As time passes, that power will grow. As to what power you have, only your soul can choose. If healing is the power your soul calls upon, then all you have to do is want it bad enough. Looking back toward the injured cougar, Michael understood. Seeing Alicia cry like that was more than enough motivation to make him want it bad enough. Michael slowly stood up and approached Micah. As he moved closer, he could smell the hint of infection that was starting to take hold of the cougar's body. If anything happened to the cougar, he knew Alicia would cry again, and she need not shed any more tears than she already had. Michael laid his hand on Micah's chest and recalled the sensations he'd felt when he and Dean had touched Cain. Concentrating on his need to see Alicia smile, he felt that need flow through him into the one he knew could make her happy. Micah started to glow softly, and Michael waited to see if he would be able to see Micah's soul like he had Cain's. After a moment, he realized that had been Dean's power, not his. Had anyone been in the room with him, they would have seen the differences taking place. Michael's eyes had started to glow a deep amethyst, and his own soul slowly became visible, superimposed within his physical form. Michael could feel a part of himself deep inside the cougar's body, flowing through his blood. He breathed a sigh of relief when the smell of infection slowly faded from the room. He couldn't see under all of the bandages to be sure, but he watched as the bruises and cuts on Micah's face healed over, then completely vanished. Pulling his hand away, Michael turned an unsteady step back. Lifting a hand to his eyes to ease the dizziness, he was surprised to feel tears on his eyelashes and cheeks. He paused for a moment, remembering that he'd also been crying when Dean had grabbed his hand and put it over Cain's dying body. Is that what Sin meant by wanting it bad enough? Did his heart and mind need to be exactly in the same place in order for it to happen? Michael looked down at his hands and sighed. How he wished Sin was here to answer his new questions. Sin was awake now, but as long as he could remember, Sin never stayed in one place, always just passing through. He'd asked Sin once what he was searching for, but Sin had only smiled with that distant look in his eyes and answered, "Some secrets are meant to be kept." Perhaps Michael would find out soon enough. For now, he would go home and rest. Healing the cougar had been taxing on him, and he needed to rest and regain his strength. Looking back at Micah, Michael decided he had one more thing to do to cover his tracks and reunite the siblings. Placing a hand on Micah's cheek, he whispered his name, compelling the cougar to wake up enough to listen to his words. When Micah's eyelashes fluttered, told him the information that would keep Alicia's whereabouts secret until he could come for her. Trevor stopped the car in front of Moondance before slamming it into park. Seeing Envy injured had taken 10 years off his life. Or at least, that's how it felt. Her being shot like that only confirmed the fact that he'd done the right thing by keeping her from knowing the truth about the paranormal world and his involvement with it for so long. By keeping his own secrets, he'd kept her out of the danger zone. "Home sweet home," he grumbled without looking at them. Getting out from behind the wheel, Trevor walked around the car to open the door for Envy, but Devon beat him to it. Devon gave Trevor the evil eye as the other man followed them inside, but didn't say anything. Devon hated the fact that he owed Trevor for saving Envy, but hated it more that it was Trevor he owed the favor to. "You don't need to come in with us," Envy offered, trying to diffuse the tense air around the two men. She even gave Trevor a small smile and a nod to let him know she wasn't just being mean, but really appreciated his help. Trevor's eyes softened when he locked gazes with Envy. "I'd feel better if I knew you were being taken care of." Envy inwardly cringed. Totally wrong thing to say. "Are you saying that I can't take care of Envy?" Devon demanded as they reached the stairs that led up to the living quarters. "Not in so many words," Trevor said as he followed Envy up the stairs. Devon's eyes widened, and he raced up behind Trevor and pushed him harshly against the wall. "Then explain it to me, Care Bear!" Trevor shrugged against the wall. "Sure thing, Thundercat." "You suck!" "Go to hell!" Devon growled loudly. "I feel a flashback from Saturday morning cartoons coming on," Envy muttered and rubbed her forehead. "How about you two stop spraying testosterone all over the place and play nice for a change? I've got a major headache, my arm hurts like hell, and the last thing I need is for you two to start fighting over who the better man is." She looked at Trevor. "Either shut up or go home. Right now, I don't care which." Devon smirked, until Envy turned her glare on him. "And you? I have the right to deny you, kitty cat. Keep it up and you'll be reduced to yowling from the alley fence." Tabitha had been waiting to hear something for a while when she heard Devon tell Trevor to go to hell. She opened the door just in time to see Envy tell both of them off, and couldn't help but giggle. At least she wasn't alone anymore. "Are the boys misbehaving again?" Tabitha asked. "You have no idea," Envy grumbled, as she walked into Warren's office with the now silent Trevor and Devon behind her. Envy slipped the jacket off her shoulders, and Tabitha's eyes widened at the blood-soaked bandage around Envy's arm. She started to have a flashback of her and Envy being held hostage by Raven and his gang of bloodsuckers, but forcibly pushed the vision back into her mental lockbox. "Will one of you guys get the first aid kit?" Tabitha asked, while looking Envy over to make sure her shoulder was the only injury. "I'll get it," Devon answered, and walked into Warren's connecting bathroom. "What happened?" Tabitha demanded, when she unwrapped the bandage and saw where a bullet had grazed her friend's arm. "Got shot at, growled at, nearly clawed, and barely outran an explosion," Envy said with a grin. But the grin disappeared when she noticed the look on her friend's face. "I'm okay, I promise," she quickly added. Ignoring Envy, Tabitha glared up at Devon when he came back into the room. "Where the hell were you when Envy got shot?" She couldn't help it. "This is my best friend, and you're supposed to be taking care of her." Trevor laughed inwardly, glad someone besides him was finally giving Devon a much-needed ass-chewing. "Fighting for our lives," Devon said in his defense. "I couldn't get her out, but Winnie the Pooh over here got her out." "That was after Hello Kitty let her get separated from him," Trevor finished, trying not to crack a grin at the thought of Devon still thinking he was a werebear. If Devon only knew the truth about what he really was. The urge to grin went away when his gaze returned to Envy. If Devon knew the truth, then Envy would know, and he was tired of getting caught up in his lies by her. Tabitha and Envy gave each other a resigned look, and Envy mouthed the word, "Help," knowing Tabby would understand. "Hey, Trevor, can you give me a ride home?" Tabitha asked, trying to get Trevor out of the room before Devon bit his head off. Or before Envy truly went off on the two of them. Trevor sighed and shoved his hands in his pockets. "Sure, let me go down and get the car started." Once Trevor had sullenly left, Envy gave Tabby a look of relief. "Thank you." Tabitha smirked. "Don't thank me, because now you both owe me one." "I'll give you everything I own!" "Does that include Envy?" Tabitha asked, her eyes twinkling. "Not a chance," Devon answered, giving her a wink. Tabitha made a disappointed face. "Well, that just takes the fun out of all of it." Envy giggled as Tabitha pranced out of the room, mock slamming the door on her way.